Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology and Raw. My guest today is Dr. Kurt Ver Beek, who is the co-founder of the Association for a More Just Society, ASJ. And he has taught as a professor of sociology for Calvin University, where he directed the Honduras Justice Studies semester with his wife, Joanne, for 20 years. He is the author of Call for Justice, co-written with Christian philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff. And he is the subject of a recent book, Bear Witness, The Pursuit of Justice in a Violent Land, written by Ross Halperin. And that latter book is sort of the subject of our conversation. We talk a lot about his work in Honduras in addressing issues of violence, which was honestly so fascinating to hear of his very courageous work that he's been involved in Honduras. So really fascinating conversation. Appreciated. Kurt's just the work that he's doing is just really remarkable. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Kurt Ver Beek. Welcome to Theology in the Raw, Kurt. I'm excited to talk to you. As I told you offline, I came across your work on short-term missions years ago and was really deeply impacted by it. It was one of those things where you experientially and academically confirmed some things I was thinking. But why don't we start with your start at the beginning? What brought you to Honduras, and what is the work you at the beginning were engaging in?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me, and very nice to be here. So we were young. My wife and I were early 20s, just graduated, just got married. We're applying for jobs a bunch of places, and we offered an internship in Costa Rica. Which we didn't even know where it was. My wife had never been on a plane. I had only flown once. So this was I'm 61. So this was in 1986. And we moved to Costa Rica to kind of just thought it would be fun and exciting. And we fell in love with Central America, with Spanish, with the culture. And 2 years later, they had a full-time job for each of us in Honduras. And they asked us to move there. So we moved there in 88, and we have been there pretty much ever since. I did a PhD at Cornell in the middle and a few other things, but most of the last 40 years we've been in Honduras.
What kind of work have you been engaged in?
So our first work, the first 8 years, was they would call it community development. I always think like World Vision kind of work is an easy way to describe it. So helping poor neighborhoods. We worked with Christian organizations, in agriculture projects, microenterprise, helping people start small businesses. And then 6 years or 8 years when you're 20 something seems like a long time. So it felt like I was ready to do something else and decided to go back to school and get my PhD. Okay.
I would imagine you've learned a lot over the years. If you were to arrive in Honduras for the first time now and engage in the same work, would you do things differently? Or what are some things you learned along the way that like, man, I've learned that this approach is not the best and we would maybe do a different approach?
Yeah, good question. So we ended up starting a program after my PhD for Calvin students, Calvin University, but we ended up having students from Westmont, Biola, Wheaton, all over. And we told them that this was the program we wished we would have gotten before we went to start working in Central America. So I think a lot of it was that, actually. Not so much that I would have done the work differently, but we should have known a lot more before we started about sort of history, culture, economics. But the probably more complicated piece of that is not only should we have known a lot more, but just better. But I think what we ended up finding when we started our Calvin program and I was teaching university students, we were talking about this community development stuff. And I guess two things. One is there's thousands of organizations in Honduras doing the same things. orphanages and small Christian schools and health centers, and it's all good stuff, but it's small, and it doesn't end up changing like the bigger structures, the bigger reasons people are poor. Kind of, I don't know, I don't want to be to minimize, but sort of the Band-Aid approach is what people often say. And so when we were teaching college students, we started asking, what about the big issues like violence in Honduras and immigration and corruption? Like what organizations, what Christians are working on those topics? And the students couldn't come up with any. And I had already been there 8 years, and I couldn't come up with, there was no Christian organizations working on those topics, and thousands of Christian organizations working on these topics of agriculture and microenterprise. And that felt like a huge weight on our shoulder. And like, that's what ended up leading us to start ASJ.
How would you describe, the systemic foundation of issues of injustice and poverty? Like, I think a lot of people listening, unless they're from Honduras or spent some time there, are probably pretty ignorant on just even the political situation, the history, the economic situation of Honduras. Like, what are some of the systemic issues that you've seen?
Well, yeah. So violence has been a huge issue in Honduras for the last certainly 15, 20 years. And you do hear about it, people showing up in the Mexican-U.S. border because they're fleeing violence, pleading asylum, etc. So I think a good example of that is, we, in our previous work, we're helping people start small businesses. So like in our neighborhood, which is a little rough, a little dangerous, there was a woman we were helping that started a pillow business, and she was doing super well. And she ended up having 3 employees full-time making pillows. And then the gang showed up and said that they were going to hurt her and her family if they didn't start paying the gang X amount a week.
Wow.
And X amount kept going up. And so very quickly, it was more than what she was making in profit. And she just closed the whole business down to avoid violence. And so like, that's the microenterprise community development model this is how you help poor people. You give them loans and they start a business, which didn't take in account the whole context of violence and gangs and really a lack of effective police. So, a lot of our early work in ASJ was trying to figure that out. Like how do we address violence that most affects the poor? Because wealthy people can have a security guard in front of their store, in front of their business, but poor people can't. So I think that's a good example of also something, how we would do things different, and how you had to fix this violence issue if you really wanted to help poor people.
It sounds impossible. Like, what do you? Well, first of all, I want to know what's the cause of the violence? Is it drug related? Is it political? And then how do you go about addressing that?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. We're going down a fun road here. So I'll tell you another story. So Joanne so Carlos moved into this rough neighborhood first. He was our best friend. So the book that we'll talk about a little bit more is about Carlos and me and our friendship and what we did, and Joanne really too. So Carlos moved into this neighborhood. So Honduras was one of the most violent countries. Tegucigalpa, one of the most violent cities, and our neighborhood was one of the most violent neighborhoods in that city. Carlos moved up there to start a school, and then we thought that was a cool thing that he was doing, brave, risky, but cool, and we decided to do the same. So we moved there for a year, and we thought, we'll just see how it goes. And that was 26 years ago. We're still living in the same neighborhood. Wow. And soon after we moved there, our kids were going to school. They went to Carlos's school in the neighborhood, and they got sent back home because we didn't know, but somebody had gotten killed. And it was the father of 2 of their classmates. And so they were kind of freaked out. But then Carlos came home the next day and said that the wife of the man who was killed came to his office, and she knew who did it. and they were 3 neighbors. And what should we do? And so Carlos and I, or ASJ, this little justice organization, was tiny, but we said, we got to do something. And so he knew a couple of like police. I knew a lawyer. We called them. We said, who can we talk to? What should we do? And they all said, don't go to the local police station because you don't know if you can trust those guys. So we'll help you find somebody. And like we made a few more phone calls and a little follow-up, but several weeks went by until these guys killed an off-duty cop. And one of them was killed and 2 of them were arrested. And that kind of the whole thing calmed down. And Carlos and I were sitting around a little while afterwards thinking about all this and talking about how terrible this was. And Carlos is like, not only did they kill this guy, they killed X, Y, and Z by my church. And I was like, I didn't know about that, but by my church, they killed A, B, and C. And he didn't know about that. And so we started adding up, in these weeks that had gone by, they had killed 13 men.
Wow.
We knew who they were, and they killed 13 men because we didn't know who to trust. And so like we felt, again, like one of these weights on we got to do something, right? Our neighbors are getting killed. And we know, even this time, we knew who they were, and we didn't know what to do. So he said, what if we could find like a Christian cop or a Christian ex-cop, and then we could trust him, and then he would know the good cops and bad cops because he was like in that system, and he would make sure like we could trust these people, and a Christian lawyer. So that's what we did. We hired, in our neighborhood, like we hired a private detective for poor people. Like usually rich people hire private detectives. We hired a private detective for poor people. And the year that we started this, we had almost 40 homicides, 25,000 people in our neighborhood. So almost one a week. And 3 years later, we had 8 homicides. And so with just 2 people, we were able to dramatically change the violence in our neighborhood. Churches didn't have evening services. Schools were closing like at 4 or 5 o'clock. Kids weren't playing in the street, playing soccer. And when this, 3 years later, that had all switched back and churches were open again. High school was open at night. Kids were playing. So then we figured out, like, it isn't impossible, right? You can build that trust up between neighbors with the police trusting neighbors. There's a little more to it. More of it's in the book.
So it's identifying law enforcement that are trustworthy. That's I would
say it's a bigger issue. It's a issue of building trust.
Okay. Oh, okay.
So building trust between the neighbors and the police, between neighbors and each other, between the police, because the police don't trust the neighbors. The neighbors don't trust the police. So nobody will talk to anybody. This is not true just in Honduras. This is true in Chicago. This is true in LA. Like these same issues happen all over the world. And like we came up with a model, ended up a big foundation hired someone to evaluate our model and said it was among the most effective violence prevention programs they had ever studied. So yeah, pretty cool.
Going back to my original question, what's the main cause of the violence?
So, I mean, people would say poverty. I think that's part of it. I actually think that it's a dysfunctional police. If you have this trust, if you have the police that are doing a good job and are trustworthy, then legitimacy is the word that actually people often use. If the police have legitimacy, then this sort of crime issues may start, but they're quickly brought down. But if people don't trust the police and the police don't trust neighbors, then it's like the recipe, and as it's a vicious circle of distrust. So there's poor people all over. There isn't crime like this. When these two things come together, it's when there is a broken security and justice system and pretty extreme poverty.
Just so I can picture, like, so when these people were killed, is it because they were the people, the perpetrator was after money, and the person that got killed didn't give them money? I mean, that might be overly simplified, but it's not like inter-gang related or drug related
So,
or
so both.
okay.
So a good chunk of the violence, maybe half, depending on when and where, maybe intra-gang violence. So gang members killing gang members, but it's never just that. And so one of the ways that gangs around the world create wealth is by extorting. So the bus driver, the taxi driver, the little store on the corner all have to pay them $20 a week or $50 a week, depending on how they negotiate. And if they don't, then somebody gets killed or somebody gets threatened, and then they maybe get shot at and then they get killed. But sometimes they kill them right away. And they don't have to do that very often, but they have to do it fairly regularly to keep everyone else in line. And it depends. There are gang members, there are leaders of these groups, some of which I think really like to do this. So then that happens more often. And until you catch that and arrest that person, that stuff can go bad very quickly.
I assume you're known in the community, and I assume what you do is known. Does that put a target on your back?
So I think Carlos and I always worried about that because we had little kids, in the neighborhood. We would drive, we would walk around, walk back and forth to church. We tried really hard at first to kind of keep our role quiet, confidential. And I would say to a large extent, we were successful. So we weren't out interviewing people, but I also know a lot of people did know. So maybe grace of God.
So has your life ever been under threat, like directly? Have you been shot at, or?
Maybe I'll tell you another story that'll answer that question. So after this story happened, we were able to bring the homicide rate in our neighborhood down from super high to relatively low, to one of the lowest in Honduras, this sort of neighborhood. And we figured that out. And then a few years later, the homicide rate in the whole country was the highest in the world. So Honduras had the highest homicide rate in the world in 2012, 2013, higher than Iraq, Afghanistan, Colombia. And that was all drug trafficking. It was Honduras was where they were sending all the cocaine from Colombia to Honduras and Honduras to the U.S. So it was like the main stopping point, and tons of people getting killed. Honduras had a homicide rate of 90 per 100,000. The U.S. is like 8. So that's like a comparison. And so we started to think maybe we could help fix that. If we could fix our neighborhood, maybe we could help fix the country. And we ended up creating an alliance, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church. We had the head of the Catholic Church, head of the Protestant Church, the head of the largest university in Honduras, us, some others, World Vision. And we started meeting every week about this. What can we do? And we ended up figuring out quite quickly that maybe half of this violence was drug related, and that the police were in on it. Oftentimes they paid the police. Sometimes the police were on their payroll to participate in this violence. And so we said, you got to purge the police force. So from 2012 to 2016, we would have events and all sorts of crazy stuff to try and put pressure on the government and the police to clean up. And in 2016, the president of Honduras called Carlos, my best friend, and said, you've been whining about this, he used some other words, for 3 years. Let's see if you have the cojones to do it. And we ended up saying yes. And so Carlos and one of our staff people became a member of the Purge Commission, is what they called it. 2 pastors who were on our board became members of it, and then 2 people the government named. So there were 6 people, 4 of them connected with us. And they ended up firing half of the police force. In the first 2 weeks, they fired all of the chief of police of the country. And there was 13,000 cops, and they ended up firing 6,000. And this is also in the book with a lot more details. The number of homicides went down from 90 per 100,000 to last year it was 22. So like a quarter of the homicide rate. And it was led by church people. I mean, it was led by our organization, Christian, and 2 pastors. One of the pastors had an attempt on his life. So 2 SUVs stopped in front of his house when he was going to go grocery shopping with his wife. 6 guys jumped out with M16s and shot at him. He and his wife weren't hit. One of his bodyguards was killed. Another bodyguard was shot 8 times. They ended up leaving the country for Texas. Carlos got tons of death threats, still gets death threats because of this. So crazy stuff. The pastor was the head of the Protestant church at that time and a pastor of a big church and one of the biggest churches in Honduras. He ended up firing police that went to his church.
Oh, wow.
Imagine that. So very brave, very cool, not your typical pastor activity, right? To be purging the police force, firing cops. But the homicide went from, 90 to 20 something. I think clearly God's work.
I mean, I don't know how you're still alive. It just seems like the people causing the violence have probably a ton of power. And you're one of the main, you, Carlos, and other people in your network are the main instigators from the perspective of getting in the way of the work they're doing, which I'm sure leads to financial loss on their part. I mean, of course, God is, we can all chalk it up to God, but I mean, does your American citizenship add any protection? Like, is Carlos at a greater risk than you are, or?
Yeah. So you heard that too. I mentioned Carlos got tons of death threats. I haven't.
Okay.
Carlos is the face of this. I'm always behind the scenes. I'm not in the press. I don't talk publicly about the work that we're doing. Carlos is the public face, and I try and make sure everything gets done at the office that's supposed to be. The pastors were super public in this whole process. But I think also we try and do everything in alliance. So it's not ASJ or Carlos and I by ourselves, but it's the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, World Vision, the business sector, which provides both strength to our message, but also protection. We try and do everything is data driven. Everything is based on facts. I have heard that in the U.S., gang members, etc., if you put them in jail for something that they did and it's well documented, you're much less likely to be a target of revenge later. But if you put them in jail for something they didn't do, like you trumped up charges against someone, then they will for sure go after you, right? So I think that may also help protect us, that our work is, we try very hard to document everything we say and do. All of our, anytime we make things public, we have percentages and facts and names and numbers, which makes it harder for people to argue with us, but also I think may provide protection.
Has your work then led to poverty relief? I guess indirectly, sort of. I mean, it seems to coincide with micro businesses and people doing the work that you mentioned at the beginning, but you're addressing the underlying systemic issues. Have you seen poverty relief happen?
Yep. So, like in our neighborhood, there's lots more small businesses that have come up. Girls were stopped going to high school because they were afraid of getting sexual violence on their way home or on the way back. Now, like back in school, So you can think of all of that stuff in the whole country as violence goes down. We don't work just on security issues. So one of them is education. So public schools. So there's 2 million kids in the public schools. So here are data-driven stuff. We did a bunch of research on different issues in public schools, and the main one we found was a problem is kids were only getting an average of 110 days of school.
Wow.
And in Honduras, they're supposed to, by law, get 200 days. So they were getting half the amount of days of school. And we worked hard on that issue, again, with Catholic Church, Protestant Church, everybody. And for 5 years running, kids were getting 213 days of school. So more than what they were supposed. So we doubled the amount of days of school kids were getting. So you can imagine like how much more kids learn. They have twice as many days of school. We're working on healthcare, making sure the public hospitals have medicines, the doctors and nurses they want. So, yeah, we have all of that fairly well documented.
Has the membership among the gangs decreased? Or is that hard to tell?
So that gang stuff is always changing. So that the gangs in Honduras have become less violent, so partly because of the stuff we were doing, but also changes in strategy. So there's 2 main gangs actually in the U.S. and all the way through Latin America, the MS-13 and the 18th Street. So these are the 2 gangs you'll hear President Trump and other people talking about. Those gangs, especially the MS-13 gang, has seen that they can be more effective, I would say, using less violence and more the threat of violence, and have transformed themselves into more like a mafia kind of financial enterprise where they own businesses. They in Honduras have, instead of directly extorting people, they have a car wash, and they make the taxi drivers and the bus drivers bring their taxis and buses to their car wash and pay higher than they would other places. And so it's not illegal. They can't get in jail for it, but they're still getting their money. Yeah. So that's
interesting.
It is. And it keeps changing. They used to accept cash, and now they do. There's electronic forms of transfer in Honduras that are like, what's the one everybody uses here? Like Cash App or
Venmo.
Venmo, yes. So it's not Venmo, but it's like that. So now the gangs have the bus and taxi drivers Venmo them money, and it's much harder for them to track, and they must less likely to get caught. So our efforts to stop this have to adjust quickly, and we're always working on that. But the police and the government is often slow to change. So we're trying to always pressure the government to adjust to these new techniques.
In the U.S., as you may be aware of, within evangelical circles, there's a debate about the relationship between the gospel and social justice. Some people would see social justice as an optional add-on. Other people say it's more intrinsic to our call as Christian leaders. Does that distinction even exist in the churches in Honduras? It sounds like issues of justice are so woven into the fabric of living in Honduras that to be a Christian leader, you don't have the luxury of even asking the question, should we care about justice?
Yeah, you do.
You do? Okay.
Yeah. So I would say, when we were in our 20s and 30s, Carlos and I were super critical of the church in Honduras, and for the same sorts of reasons that it's often discussed here. And so a good friend of mine is Nicholas Wolterstorff, a Christian philosopher. He wouldn't call himself a theologian, but I think he often is. And he's come to Honduras and visited our work several times. We wrote a book together. People could look that up. But, he says there are 2 major themes. I think everybody knows this in the Bible as you read it through. It's love and justice. And those are like the two pieces of God's character. And if we want to live biblically out our faith, we need to be concerned about both of those. So this whole idea of distinctions between justice and social justice, honestly, I don't feel like I even get it usually. But I think we are to live loving lives and just lives, and we are to fight for love and justice wherever we are. And Wolterstorff says that almost always, not almost always, but very common when justice is mentioned in the Bible, he calls the triad of the vulnerable. And it's the poor, the widow, and the orphan. The poor, the widow, and the orphan. Sometimes the foreigner. So sometimes it's four. And that we should especially seek justice for those groups. So I think that's where ASJ's work is born, out of trying to live out that call, I think, God's heart to love and to seek justice for those who are most vulnerable, like the people in our neighborhood who are getting killed. And then our mission statement at ASJ is we are seeking to be brave Christians, trying to get the Honduran justice, education, healthcare system working for the most vulnerable. So it's all quite different things from the average nonprofit. So I think this idea of being brave Christians, like if you go out in the street in Idaho or Michigan and ask people to describe Christians, they will use a bunch of words, loving, compassionate, hypocritical, depending on who it is. I don't think you will have one person tell you brave. But if you read the Bible, the prophets, life of Jesus, the apostles, I don't think you could not include brave as one of the distinctives. So we are calling the church in Honduras, but also now the church in the US, to reclaim this. What does it mean to be brave? And I think it doesn't take up much bravery to love someone, but it does take bravery to fight for justice for someone. So what does that look like? And then we trying to be brave Christians to make the Honduran system work. So the Honduran public school system has 2 million kids in it. We can never build enough little Christian schools for 2 million kids. But if we can get the public schools working, really teaching, wouldn't that be, that would make God happy, right? And the public health system, the police, if we can get the police working, and people are like, oh, you never could. Well, I just told you, you could, at least way better.
Yeah.
And then for the most vulnerable. So especially for those poor people. And what's cool is in Honduras and lots of the world, the public systems are the ones the poor depend on. So if you got some money, you send your kids to a private school or you go to a private doctor. But if you're poor, you got to use the public. You use the public schools, the public healthcare, you depend on the police. So if we can get those public systems working, we automatically are helping the most vulnerable.
This episode is brought to you by MitoPure by Timeline. MitoPure is the only urolithium A supplement on the market clinically proven to target the effects of age-related cellular decline. And now you can take this powerful supplement in gummy form. That's right, the first ever longevity gummies powered by MitoPure makes it even easier to put energy into your day. Okay, so I'm turning 50 years old next year. I can't believe it. And I'm already feeling the effects of aging. I mean, our bodies simply make less energy as we get older. But now you can help recharge the batteries of your cells by taking MitoPure's longevity gummies, which transforms cellular damage into energy. By delivering 6 times more urolithium A than a glass of pomegranate juice, the longevity gummies will increase your sustained energy, boost muscle endurance, and support faster recovery after exercise. If you want to stay strong and energized now as you age, then you have to try these MitoPure gummies. And my friends over at Timeline are offering my listeners a free sample of the new MitoPure gummies. Just head over to timeline.com/Theology Gummies to get started. That's timeline.com/Theology Gummies. Your cells will thank you. You shifting gears just a little bit, you've seen in your almost 40 years now, I'm sure, many short-term mission trips come to Honduras. You've done extensive research on this. Yeah. So I would love, yeah. What are, so let's just start with maybe pros and cons that you've seen over the years of short-term mission trips. And maybe, I know you have some healthy critiques, so maybe there aren't any pros. I don't know, but are there pros and cons to short-term missions in your 40 years of experience in seeing this?
So lots of people say that I'm anti-short-term missions, and I'm not. I think I would like more people to go. I would like more people to go to Honduras. I think, and then people say, yeah, well, Kurt would like more people to come, but he's worried. So the two things people often add to short-term missions is a bunch of training in advance, which I'm not even sure that's that helpful. Or what you do there has to be different. And I'll give you one example. Like, we were with a short-term mission group one time, and they were throwing tortillas to each other like frisbees. And Joanne and I were all upset. And like, that was so disrespectful. These poor people have hardly any food, and they're throwing tortillas like frisbees. And so we hollered at them and said, don't be disrespectful as people. And then we were talking to some of the community people later, and they were like, what was your favorite things? And they're like, oh, we just love spending time with them. And like, that was so funny when they were throwing tortillas to each other like frisbees. Like, so even like, we thought of these Hondurans as super fragile, and like this group could somehow mess them up in a week, and I don't think they are. Hondurans are super resilient. So what's my major critique? My major critique is people go on short-term missions to go and do something. And then they'll come back and tell you what they did. Like, why did you go? You ask grandma and grandpa for money because we're going to go paint a church, or we're going to do VBS. 90% of Honduran is Christian already. Like, almost everybody goes to Catholic or Protestant church. So I think that why people should be going on short-term missions, but almost never are, is to really change themselves. And people will say that, but it's not really happening. So I would measure the success of short-term missions based on what happens when people come back. So they go to Honduras, but then those kids go to a school that's half Latino, but they don't have a single Latino friend. Or their church is all white, and a Latino comes in and they don't feel welcome, but they loved spending time with those Hondurans when they were in Honduras. Or they gave 2% of their income to missions before, and when they come back a year later, they're still giving 2%. Or they volunteered in Africa at an AIDS orphanage, but there's AIDS patients in Chicago and they're not volunteering there, right? So the way I would measure the success or failure of short-term missions is not how much training they got, even very much about how much they do. All of this is caveated, right? I'm simplifying. I think they need a little training. I think it's a little important what they do. You could do terrible things. Most of them aren't. But the way I would measure the success of short-term missions is what has changed in your life a year later. And I think that's not impossible, but it's a little bit harder. Okay, I got time for one story quick?
Sure, yeah.
So my dad did Marriage Encounter when I was in high school. And he went for a weekend with my mom. And when he came back, they were all like lovey-dovey, kissing, touching. It was like freaking us all out. It lasted like a month, and that was done. When I was in college, my mom and dad did Marriage Encounter, and they had to set a bunch of goals. Both times they had to set goals. But then every month for a year, they met at church for 2 hours, husbands and wives separate, and then they would come together. And every month they had to tell my dad had to tell the other men what his goals were and did he do them. So go out on a date once a month with my mom, buy her flower, all the stuff she wanted, and she would try and do some of the stuff he wanted every month. And my mom died 6 years ago tomorrow. Till she died, they did devotions together every morning. They would go on a weekend away just with the two of them in their 80s, 2 or 3 times a year, because those were patterns and habits that they formed after marriage encounter. So why am I telling you this? So if we went on short-term missions trip, I think it's more important to start meeting once a month to set goals. Like, what are you going to change in your life when you get back to Chicago? I'm going to start giving more money. I'm going to volunteer at the Chicago AIDS patients. And then meet once a month with that group for an hour or for 2 hours after church and hold each other accountable and create habits. I'm going to start giving more money. I'm going to start volunteering, whatever it is. I think then you're going to see a year later that short-term mission trip change people's lives, but because people were held accountable to do it.
And would you bake that into the pre-trip training?
You
so
can
that
only
it's
go.
expected.
My mom and dad had to sign a contract before they went to that marriage encounter that they committed to 2 hours once a month for a year, and that made the difference. I think it's the same thing. You want to go on short-term missions? Grandpa and Grandma are going to pay for it. We'll give you a couple hours of training before you go, but you got to have, in your youth group or whatever you're going to do it, once a month for an hour or 2 hours, where you're going to have set a bunch of goals and you're going to hold each other accountable if you did it. I mean, it's the same thing like at New Year, New Year's resolutions. We're going to start running. We're going to get in shape. We're going to lose weight. If you don't have anybody to hold you accountable, you don't do it. So I think we need that. And if short-term missions, that experience of being in Honduras for a week can be life-changing, but you need someone to help you actually put that into practice when you come back.
You've done that's really helpful, and I agree. You've done research on the negative impact of building projects. I remember being really impacted by that. Can you help us understand, because this is such a popular thing, right? Among short-term missions, you go in and you engage in a building project, and on the face of it, it seems really like you're just super helping them, blessing the community, and maybe there's some pros. Actually, yeah. Are there any pros to building projects, and what are some of the cons?
I'll start with, I always like to end with the positive. I'll start with the negative.
Okay.
So like Honduras got hit by Hurricane Mitch, 1998. Terrible hurricane. Parked over Honduras for 5 days. Like, wow. Imagine hurricane winds and rains for 5 days. Jeez. So just awful. One of the groups came down, wanted to build houses. Somebody in the church made garage doors. So they're like, hey, what if this guy donated like thousands of garage doors and we'll figure out how to turn them into a house, and then it'll be cheap and we can put them up fast and stuff. So on the north coast of Honduras, where it's very hot and very humid, these church people had figured out to use like a 2x4 structure and stick the garage doors to it and cut out some holes for doors and windows. Well, those 2x4s rotted in 2 years. The structure's flying apart. And those garage doors, when you cut them open, had like a sort of insulation in the middle that caused all kinds of allergic reactions among the people. And so just imagine, right? Like these super hot environment, the sun baking these houses and people inside getting allergic reactions to the stuff. And then the house is falling over a couple of years later. So it probably would have cost another 30% to build cement block houses, or adobe wall blocks houses, even better. Would have taken longer. Local people could have done it with, again, I'm not anti, like, come down, build the first 3 houses, and then local Hondurans will build the other 30. So it's a good example, I think, of super good intentions, like after a hurricane, wanting to do the right thing, but often it doesn't quite work out that well. I know another school project where a high school group came down and ran all the wiring for a new high school, And as soon as they left, they had to rip it all out and have an electrician put it back in because the kids didn't know how to do wiring, which is, so like good intentioned. I also, flip side, during this Hurricane Mitch research I did on short-term missions, was very powerfully impacted. I mean, I dozens of interviewees that we would interview would start crying and say, I lost my house and I'm so poor. And I thought I would never have a house again. And God gave me this house, this group of Canadians, this group of people from Chicago came down and financed it or helped us build these houses. And, I'm just so thankful. So having a house, having property, not renting, not living in a shack on the edge of a river is super powerful, changes people's lives. So it's not a bad thing. Again, that's a good example of what I minimized, but I shouldn't have so much. It is important what we do and how we do it, to think that through a little bit.
It sounds like working with and underneath local leaders in these building projects so that you don't put in toxic garage doors or whatever, or establishing a building that isn't conducive to the environment that you're not familiar with.
Yeah. I have some short-term materials that are online, Preston, where you put the link in and something. But one of the things, like people get nervous when you say under, maybe not in theory, but in practice they do. They don't like anybody being in charge of them, like lots of these short-term mission leaders. But I said, if you were going to, say a short-term mission trip to Honduras easily spends $50,000. You get 20 high schoolers, quickly $100,000. So if you were going to invest $100,000 in some stock or something, in some mutual fund, you would do some research, right? You'd call up some experts and figure out before you spent all that money. But oftentimes we don't do any research about who we're, doing these $100,000 investment with. It's the missionary from our church, or it's, this kid's aunt who's in the Dominican, and she may be like a cranky old missionary who's been there years and doesn't even like Dominicans. And like, there are plenty of missionaries that are like that. Yeah. So, because she's so cranky, the other missionaries say, you just run our short-term missions program, right? Like, that's how it often happens. So, like, if we would do research about a mutual fund, let's do research about who we're going to do this with. And let's ask around, like, we're thinking about going to Honduras. People in your church will know, and ask around, like, who's doing the most interesting, the coolest work in Honduras? And I could get an email, and a few other people get emails, and we send you some names. And then you call people and you look at their website. It's maybe like a day's work, maybe 8 hours, right? It's not like months of research. And if you can find a really good partner, then you can just trust them. They're not going to have you building garage doors, houses. They're not going to have you wiring, running electric wires through a high school, right? They're going to have you doing appropriate things. And they're going to have, if you do something stupid, throw tortillas like frisbees, they're going to know how to soothe that over after you leave, right? So I think instead of worrying so much on our end, like, am I doing the right thing? Just spend a little time finding the best missionaries, the best organization in whatever country you're going, and they'll take care of the rest.
Okay. Is there a negative impact on the economics of a city or village when short-term mission trips are, in a sense, coming in with like free labor? Does that have a negative impact on the economics of the community, or is it complex?
It's not complex. It's pretty simple. Okay, so the high schoolers came and painted the church. It took them 3 days. There was 20 teenagers. They probably didn't do a very good job. They'll probably have to repaint it again in a year or two, and then they'll hire some Hondurans to do it. It would have been, a couple $100 job for somebody else. So yeah, again, if those high schoolers go back and over the next year raise $20,000 each, like that wouldn't be hard, right? 20 high schoolers. Okay, I'm going to do the math. 20 high schoolers, and let's commit to raising $1,000 a month each between our parents and our grandparents, and we're going to do a bike ride, and we're going to raise money for Honduras. If those 20 raised, let's say $12,000 each, that would be $240,000 to support that missionary or that organization in Honduras that they went to paint for. And then you'd be like, oh, that was a fabulous investment for that missionary, or that, right? They could have given a $500 painting job to some Honduran. But those kids ended up raising $240,000 just the first year. And now that's money that's going to go into building a new church or a new school or painting a whole bunch of places. And if they keep doing that, like they raised $240 the first year, but maybe they keep doing it, maybe it goes down, but 10 years later, they're still raising money for that missionary. So I think that's the typical criticism of these groups, like that the Hondurans are fragile, they're taking jobs away from Hondurans, they're doing this and that, which is all true, not that true. But if that's the end of the story, then that's all it is. Okay. But if those kids come back and are praying for that church, they're raising money for that church, they're volunteering in their own neighborhoods, they're helping AIDS orphans in Chicago, then like the cost benefit analysis switches over completely.
So it sounds like you're saying the physical work that these short-term trips produce is not really the main benefit. It's the relational connection that if that can extend over a long period of time, that far outweighs the material payoff of whatever work they did in the 10, 12, 20 days that they were there.
Yeah. So like I know a group in Chicago that would go down to an orphanage for a week with a bunch of men and their sons and daughters. And like, they'd say, we just love on those kids. Like they didn't speak English. They didn't speak Spanish. They would hang out, they play soccer. But 20 years later, almost all of those guys are still giving money to Honduras, to that orphanage. Their kids care about that. So like, was like the cost benefit analysis, we need to stretch it out way bigger than the typical critique or the typical positives, right? So they say, oh, it was worth it because VBS, like if we had one person's, make a commitment to Christ, that soul is of immeasurable value, right? Or we painted this church, or we did this or that. All of that might be true, but it's probably still minimal compared to, like my mom and dad still doing devotions together 60 years later, right? If the people who went to Honduras as teenagers continue, maybe not even Honduras, but continue, giving more of their income to missions, to praying more to listening to the news and to like writing their congressman or their senator about X issue that's going on in Honduras or Philippines or wherever they are, like then it was like super worth it. That trip was like hands down, send 100 more people there because we know 20, 30 years later, this is still going to be paying off. But then we got to just create that little structure to make sure that happens.
Oh, that's helpful. That's really helpful. I'm curious, as you're talking, what's the general perception among Hondurans about Americans? Is it a positive perception? Is it mixed? Is it negative?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in Latin America, there's all sorts of each country, parts of countries probably have quite different perspectives, but Hondurans love North Americans.
Really?
I would say often despite the facts. So yes, I would say, very seldom did Joanne and I get sort of a negative reaction from someone when they meet us. Almost always like neutral or sometimes extremely positive. So, and there's a long history of U.S. involvement there.
Yeah, I was curious because I know the U.S. has kind of done lots of pretty terrible things to a lot of Central American countries. I mean, Guatemala and
despite
Nicaragua.
The facts, like I said.
Yeah. Is Honduras? Yeah, I'm blanking now on the history of Honduras with that. Have they been a victim of a U.S.-backed coup or
so Honduras in the 1880s? U.S. mining companies went in and took tons of gold and silver and didn't leave a whole lot afterwards. The 1900s, the banana companies, Chiquita and Dole, went in, bought up lots of the property. Were some positives out of that, a lot of negatives too. Kind of imposed their will. Often the companies were way bigger than the Honduran governments, way more powerful than the Honduran governments. So not a lot of limits set around what they could do and couldn't do. And we have the Contra Wars in the 80s of Ronald Reagan, where the U.S. was pumping tons of money into Honduras to arm the Contras, who were Nicaraguans living in Honduras. So Honduras had a foreign army in its own country, tons of corruption and stuff around that. So yeah, there's a lot of things Hondurans could be upset about.
Yeah.
But I think in general, the perception is, and even if some people would say that, like, even if we don't always like what the government does or what businesses do, but they like North Americans, they feel like the people of the United States are good and care about them. And it's some true. There's lots of short-term missions down, lots of people coming down, good intentions, friendly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. Hey, in the last couple minutes, tell us about the book Bear Witness. I forget, is it out? Yeah, it's out already, right?
Came out in May.
Yeah.
Bear Witness. The author is Ross Halprin. I'm sure you can put the link in the site or something. But it tells the story in a lot more detail of the things I just told you about, the gang violence in our neighborhood, the police purge, our education work. It was written by a journalist, so we didn't pay him. I think he got it mostly right. We're not happy with all of it. You can also go to the ASJ website. It's asj.us, and we have a piece of the website dedicated to the book. There's an interview with me, with Carlos, with the author, that gives you a little more background about the book and about our organization.
Did he come down and live with you guys for a while?
Yeah. So we met him. I was speaking in New York City at an event on violence and violence prevention, and he got fascinated with this little story I just kind of told you. So he came down to write an article. Then he was going to write like a short article. Then it was going to be like a New York Times Magazine article, like a longer version. And then he decided it was going to be a book. And he ended up working 7 years full time on this. So
wow,
this was this was his main job for the last 7 years. Did tons of research, tons of interviews. It reads as a novel. So it's nonfiction, but it reads as a novel. I think people will like it.
What will people walk away after reading the book, or what kind of person would be interested in this book?
So it's somewhat like a crime novel. It's a little bit like, could you reduce violence in a neighborhood? Could you reduce violence in a country? Here's a couple of kind of crazy people who thought they could and came at it from a very Christian perspective, which the author is not a Christian. He's raised sort of non-practicing Jew, so he worked hard to get that part right. I think another thing he got mostly right, like why Carlos and I were doing what we were doing. And I think it's a fun read.
Awesome. Well, Kurt, thank you so much for being a guest on Theology in the Raw. Where can people find you and your work? You mentioned the ASJ website.
ASJUS.org.
Okay. Thanks again. Appreciate you.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.